On March 5, 1946, scarcely a year after the conclusion of World War II, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his landmark speech titled The Sinews of Peace at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, at the invitation of U.S. President Harry S. Truman. In this address, Churchill famously coined the phrase Iron Curtain to vividly characterize the Soviet sphere of influence stretching across the European continent, explicitly warning of the existential threat posed by the USSR to Western democracies. He urged the United States and Britain to forge a strong alliance and jointly curb Soviet expansionist ambitions. This historic oration, later immortalized as the Iron Curtain speech, marked the formal commencement of the Cold War, a geopolitical standoff that would endure for nearly half a century between the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union. The origins of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War can be traced back to the Second World War. As two emerging powers that rose to prominence during the conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union temporarily set aside their differences in social systems and ideologies to establish cooperation against fascist aggression. However, as the war drew to a close, contradictions gradually surfaced between the two nations over the construction of the post-war world order and the distribution of respective interests. Having paid a tremendous price in the Great Patriotic War, losing 27 million lives and approximately a quarter of its social wealth, the Soviet Union prioritized building its security buffer to prevent future invasions. Consequently, Eastern European countries liberated by the Red Army embarked on socialist paths after the war, becoming Soviet satellite states. This geopolitical realignment further exacerbated U.S.-Soviet antagonism, laying the groundwork for the systemic confrontation that would define the Cold War era. While consolidating national security, Stalin did not entirely rule out the possibility of peaceful coexistence with the United States. He maintained that despite profound differences in economic systems and ideologies, resolving U.S.-Soviet differences through peaceful means was not only feasible but also necessary for the sake of global peace. However, the evolution of the international situation often defied expectations. The Soviet Union's security strategy inevitably collided with America's pursuit of global hegemony. American political figures perceived the USSR and its promoted socialist ideology as existential threats, viewing the socialist revolutionary wave sweeping the globe with trepidation and apprehension. In the immediate post-war period, European nations remained severely weakened by the scars of war, while Britain's hegemonic position steadily eroded. A geopolitical vacuum that intensified superpower rivalry and reshaped the Cold War's early dynamics. Amid this historical juncture, the United States proactively assumed leadership in Europe. With overwhelming economic and military superiority, particularly as the sole nuclear power possessing atomic weapons, the U.S. was propelled to adopt a confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain speech delivered on March 5, 1946, marked the first post-war instance of a Western leader openly expressing hostility toward the USSR. Orchestrated by U.S. President Harry Truman, this address strategically articulated Washington's unspoken geopolitical agenda through British channels, laying ideological groundwork for the subsequent Truman Doctrine. Following World War II, Europe's economies lay in ruins, with unemployment rates soaring and waves of labor movements sweeping the continent. Across Western Europe, communist parties rapidly expanded their influence. Membership surged from 500,000 in 1939 to 4 million by 1947 in less than a decade. President Truman feared that if Greece fell under communist control, it would trigger a chain reaction engulfing Turkey and the broader Middle East, a crisis whose repercussions would extend beyond the East to jeopardize Western interests. Under mounting pressure, the United States resolved to abandon restraint and prepare for direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. On March 12, 1947, President Truman articulated a national political ideology and foreign policy centered on containing communism in his State of the Union address, a doctrine later termed the Truman Doctrine. Under this policy framework, the United States provided financial and military aid to the Greek government forces, ultimately suppressing the Greek Popular Revolution. Throughout the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine remained the cornerstone of U.S. diplomatic strategy, though its essence lay in interfering in the internal affairs of other nations. Positioning itself as the guardian of the free world, the U.S. routinely intervened in sovereign states, reductively attributing any perceived threats to Western societies to communist agitation while overlooking systemic flaws within capitalism itself. This ideological bias, embedded in the Truman Doctrine, would prove to be its most enduring legacy, reshaping global power dynamics while entrenching a Manichaean worldview that polarized international relations for decades. The proclamation of the Truman Doctrine marked the formal commencement of the Cold War between the US and Soviet blocs. To operationalize this strategy, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1947. Between 1948 and 1952, Western European nations received approximately $13 billion in U.S. aid, 90% as grants and 10% as loans, effectively constituting a free provision. Yet why such extraordinary generosity? Was it driven by pure altruism? Certainly not. On one level, the Marshall Plan legitimized American dominance over Europe's political and economic architecture, binding Western Europe to U.S. economic dependencies. Simultaneously, it addressed America's post-war crisis of industrial overcapacity by channeling surplus production to European markets. Moreover, reviving Western Europe, the Cold War's frontline, bolstered the capitalist bloc's collective strength. The plan proved remarkably effective. It tightened Washington's grip on Western Europe while enabling war-torn nations to rebuild their economies and emerge from devastation. This dual-engine strategy fused humanitarian rhetoric with hard-nosed geopolitics, cementing America's role as architect of the post-war order. Under the Marshall Plan's assistance, the period from 1948 to 1952 witnessed Europe's fastest economic growth in history, with industrial output surging by 35%. By the plan's conclusion, Western Europe's economy had not only recovered to pre-war levels but also entered a 20-year phase of rapid expansion. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan epitomized the political and economic execution of America's global hegemony strategy, defining U.S. foreign policy for over 4 post-war decades. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union consolidated its grip on Eastern Europe through political purges and the Molotov Plan, tightening political and economic control over its satellite states. The fundamental divergence in social systems and ideologies between the U.S. and USSR inexorably propelled them toward conflict, with their first major showdown occurring during the 1948 Berlin blockade. Post-war Germany, the birthplace of World War II, was divided into occupation zones administered by the US, USSR, Britain, and France. Berlin, though situated within the Soviet zone, was similarly partitioned into quadripartite sectors. This geopolitical anomaly, a capitalist enclave deep within Soviet-controlled territory, became the flashpoint for recurrent Cold War crises. The 1948 blockade, where Stalin severed land access to West Berlin, marked the opening salvo in a decades-long struggle for ideological and territorial dominance, crystallizing Europe's Iron Curtain division. The United States and the Soviet Union held irreconcilable positions on Germany's post-war fate. Having suffered catastrophic economic devastation from the German invasion, the USSR sought a unified Germany governed by uniform economic policies across all occupation zones to secure sufficient reparations as stipulated by the Potsdam Agreement, which granted Moscow reparation claims not only from its own occupation zone but also from sectors under US, British, and French control. Conversely, the US aimed to partition Germany, transforming its western half into a strategic foothold against Soviet influence in Western Europe. In March 1948, the US, British, and French occupation zones merged under American leadership. By June, a unilateral currency reform introduced new Deutsche Marks in Western zones, a move that provoked fierce Soviet opposition. To pressure the West and derail plans for a West German state, the USSR blockaded Berlin on June 24th, severing all land and water routes between Western occupation zones in the city while permitting only 3 air corridors. This confrontation, known as the First Berlin Crisis, transformed the divided capital into a geopolitical anomaly, a capitalist island encircled by Soviet-controlled territory, and escalated Cold War tensions to unprecedented levels, cementing Germany's status as the Cold War's central battleground. Confronting the Soviet blockade, the United States leveraged its formidable air power to launch an unprecedented Berlin airlift, delivering up to 8,000 tons of daily supplies, food, fuel, and essentials, to sustain West Berlin's 2.5 million residents. Simultaneously, Washington imposed counter-blockade measures, halting coal, steel, and electricity shipments to Soviet-occupied zones. As the operation progressed, the economic cost of sustaining the airlift escalated, while Soviet industries suffered shortages from severed access to Western commodities and raw materials. By May 1949, mutual exhaustion compelled both superpowers to negotiate. On May 12, the USSR lifted the blockade, ending the 11-month First Berlin Crisis. This confrontation crystallized the irreconcilable divide over Germany's future. Washington and Moscow tacitly accepted partition as inevitable. Within weeks, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and German Democratic Republic, East Germany, emerged as sovereign states, their bifurcation formalizing Europe's Cold War divide. The crisis proved containment's efficacy while exposing the perils of direct superpower confrontation, a lesson that shaped nuclear deterrence strategies for decades. On September 20, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was formally established, followed by the proclamation of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, on October 7 of the same year. This dual founding cemented the division of a once unified Germany into two ideologically opposed states, each embodying the Cold War's stark political and economic dichotomy. Meanwhile, the superpowers consolidated their spheres through military alliances. On April 4, 1949, the United States and Western European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, establishing the U.S.-led NATO military bloc. In response, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites convened in Warsaw, Poland, on May 14, 1955, to ratify the Warsaw Pact, creating a counterbalancing socialist alliance. The parallel emergence of NATO and the Warsaw Pact symbolized the formal militarization of Cold War rivalry, transforming ideological competition into a global standoff of armed blocs. Germany's division became the geopolitical epicenter of early Cold War tensions, encapsulating the irreconcilable clash between U.S. capitalist democracy and Soviet socialist authoritarianism. Berlin, bisected yet deep within Soviet-controlled territory, would remain a powder keg of superpower confrontation for decades to come. In 1958 and 1961, the Second and Third Berlin crises erupted consecutively. West Berlin, located within East German territory yet hosting stationed U.S., British, and French troops, became a thorn in the side for the Soviet Union and East Germany within the socialist bloc. The city evolved into a hub of Western intelligence operations, with numerous espionage agencies and operatives clandestinely gathering Soviet intelligence. Among these, the most notorious was the Berlin Tunnel, a covert project jointly constructed by the CIA and British intelligence. This subterranean passage tapped into Soviet underground communication cables, enabling Anglo-American forces to intercept classified information. Equipped with 600 tape recorders operating around the clock, the facility consumed over 800 reels of tape daily, harvesting vast quantities of Soviet military and diplomatic secrets. However, the tunnel was discovered and exposed by Soviet counterintelligence in 1956. Citing security concerns, Moscow demanded the withdrawal of Western troops from West Berlin, but these ultimatums were refused. Meanwhile, West Berlin's stark economic superiority over its eastern counterpart triggered a mass exodus of East Germans. Nearly 3 million fled westward between 1949 and 1961. This hemorrhaging of skilled labor crippled East Germany's workforce, prompting the eventual construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. The crises underscored Berlin's symbolic and strategic role as both a Cold War battleground and a tragic stage for ideological rivalry, where espionage, innovations, and human desperation intertwined to shape Cold War history. Due to West Berlin's unique status posing a direct threat to East Germany's political security, economic development, and social stability, the East German government began constructing the Berlin Wall along the border between East and West Berlin on August 15, 1961, to prevent unrestricted movement of people. The Berlin crisis was ultimately resolved in this manner. The Berlin Wall not only symbolized the division of East and West Germany but also became an emblem of Europe's, and indeed the world's, ideological schism, standing as the most iconic structure embodying Cold War tensions. Having reviewed the origins and escalation of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War in Europe following World War II, let us now turn our attention to the other side of the globe, Asia, where the superpower rivalry would ignite proxy wars, reshape alliances, and redefine the contours of 20th-century geopolitics. The previous content reviewed the origins and intensification of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War in post-World War II Europe. In the next episode, We'll shift our focus to Asia on the other side of the globe, where superpower rivalry would spark proxy wars, reshape alliances, and redefine the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.